Recording in progress. So welcome to the second half of lecture 8. We're going to be working in Photoshop. I just got done downloading the lecture 8 new PowerPoint and the lecture 8 Photoshop files. And right now we're going to kind of go over what to look for when you're trying to find textures to work with. This goes for Substance, this goes for Photoshop too. So a couple of things you want to keep in mind. So the default textures that we give you are in the folder here. So we've got a clone stamp practice that we're going to do. We're going to kind of go over real quick just to get everybody familiar with the clone stamp tool. So we're all on the same page. That's going to be one of the big tools we use in getting rid of unwanted pieces of an image. Now, you can select stuff and copy and paste, but the clone stamp is a lot more efficient. And in addition to the clone stamp, we can get rid of areas where we don't necessarily want to replace pixels, but we want to average color variations together. And that's the healing brush, works really well for that. So, like I said, the clone stamp is really good for getting rid of seams, getting rid of unwanted parts, taking one area, cloning it into another to kind of make up for what's been lost, either for it being cropped or for just, in this case, blemishes on the image we want to get rid of. And this kind of technique is good for taking old family photos, the kind that have actually on paper and maybe they're crinkled, they're cracked, they've got splotches on them, scan them in and you can clean them up in Photoshop and make them look real nice, or at least better than they were. All right, so this is what the brick wall by default looks like if you throw it onto a surface. And this is just kind of a simple interior environment. We got a wall, a floor, and a couple of pieces of furniture. So on the floor, we've got the default wood floor texture on there. And you can see it's got seams. It's got areas where they don't line up. You've got color variations. Same thing for that kind of alligator skin, reptile hide texture that we have thrown on these little stools. Now, that's what they look like by default. None of them are repeatable, but after making it repeatable, we kind of get rid of the seams, try to make it look a lot more usable. You can notice a big difference between the floor and the ottoman also, where we've got repeating areas here and color variations. We try to average them together. So for the floor, that's just got a simple board-on-board texture that we made repeatable. The ottoman's a little bit harder because those reptile skin, leathery kind of cells, they're not very linear, they're very organic, so they're kind of hard to match up. But for that, we made a bump map, we made a spec map for it, and the workflow for those are at the bottom of the PowerPoint here. But we're just going to work with the brick wall because the brick wall is one of the best things to start if you've never made a repeatable texture, because brick, usually straight lines, right angles, much easier and more forgiving to make repeatable than something that's a lot more organic. So we're going to make a base color map and a bump map for it. All right, so what's appropriate reference? Intro to Photoshop. Really, most of you have used Photoshop, so it's not going to be an intro, but more of like a these are the tools we're going to use, and here are some of the settings you need to look out for. Now, some things to avoid when you're trying to find reference images and or texture images, especially for textures. You want to avoid flash photography. You want to avoid having light baked in or as part of the photo in your texture. Because when you assign it in your environment, that lighting may not match what you have in your environment. So in addition to unwanted highlights, you're liable to get shadows. Shadows also indicate time of day, light direction. And you want to have all of that from your lighting. And also kind of baked in reflectivity. That already implies there's an environment there that isn't necessarily your environment, and nothing looks more artificial than a texture with a highlight in the same spot as you move around the room. That really becomes noticeable, like, hey, that's really a fake. So we know how to make an anisotropic material like this, basically brushed metal. We know how to make it look rough. We know how to stretch the highlight. So gradient patterns may look really cool, but again, that's a result of light on a reflective surface, usually being reflected in the middle and getting darker on the edges. All right, so Photoshop. First off, yep, I want to make sure I'm not running Maya, because Maya and Photoshop, let me quit out of everything that I don't need running, because Photoshop, just like Maya, wants all of the memory. It's greedy. All right, so what I'm going to do is open up, and I've got it in my downloads. I'm going to open up the Lecture8 Photoshop files, the clone stamp practice image that we took. And this is from Full Sail 4B in room 127. Before I think, I haven't been in there in years, honestly, because we're always in these rooms. I think they don't have carpet anymore in there. I think it's all concrete. You guys remember? It's the room, if you go into 4B from the front, it's all the way in the back on the right. I think it's 127, 128, 129. I think they're all stripped and the floors are bare. They're all that polished concrete like we have. Anyway, this is before they ripped the carpet up. They were basically, there was a lot of construction material all over. And consequently, there's a lot of blobby stuff all over the carpet. Bits of dust, debris, dirt, bits of paper all over the place. Perfect for playing around with a clone stamp. All right. So, a couple of things. In Photoshop, I opened up the image, comes in at 100%. Looks pretty small. Okay, a couple of quick navigation things which you guys are probably aware of already. But in Photoshop, if you do on the Mac Command plus or minus, that will zoom into your image in increments. And you can go all the way into the pixel level, and Command minus will zoom out, and you can pretty much go to a pixel there. So Command plus and minus, if you're on a PC, it's control. So usually with this, I like to zoom in a little bit when I work. Now, in Photoshop, if you're zoomed in and you want to move around inside the image, well, you can use these scroll bars on the left and right, or actually on the right side, go left and right at the bottom to navigate around, or hold the space bar, and the space bar will give you the hand tool where you can pan around manually. So it's a real good way to get around. In any tool, hit the space bar, it'll give you the hand, you can move around. So really good, quick navigation feature. Like I said, many of you probably know this already. All right, so in Photoshop, on the left were your tools, any tool that you have selected. So let me go down and choose the crop tool. So the crop tool is the one that looks like two right angles that form kind of a box. So if I select it, let me zoom out here. Oh, and sometimes in Photoshop, if you are using a tool, there we go. Stop Photoshop. All right, so you can see Photoshop is being really trippy with me. Let me stop my talking head camera because that's probably taking a few resources away. Let's see if that helps. No, oh, it's still trippy. All right. Let me close this out and open it again. I didn't really do anything. It's still the same. Thank you, Photoshop. Let me quit out of Photoshop. I think I ran out of memory. I just updated Photoshop too. Okay. What's that? Yeah. All right, let's go open again. Let's try this. All right. Wow. Okay. Party on Photoshop. All right. Well, we're going to ignore that. Pretend it's not happening. Okay. So when you have a tool selected, so let me, for example, select the paintbrush. Okay, simple paintbrush. When you select a tool in Photoshop, across the top underneath the main menus, you get tool options. Very similar to Maya's attribute editor. You can edit the attributes of the tool. So for example, we've got brush information here. Size, hardness, if you had any presets in the brush, they'd show up there. We've got mode, opacity, flow, smoothing, all the stuff that you guys are probably used to. And you probably are used to using opacity and flow to kind of feather your lines or build up line weight in Photoshop, which makes sense to do. All right, so the main body of the Photoshop window is going to be comprised of your image on the right, the layers, channels, paths. We're interested in the layers section. Wow, okay, stop doing stuff, Photoshop. You're scaring me. All right, so we got layers. And if you see a kind of darkened triangle next to your tool, if you right click, you will see tools that are very similar to that same tool. So right click and you'll have some different tool options that are kind of, umbrellaed under the main tool. Ah, yes, there's our Florida storm. So just make sure you save once in a while you're working. Even though, we got computers, they've got batteries, we may lose Wi-Fi. Just warning everybody in Zoom, don't take it personally if all of a sudden we drop off the face of the earth because we ran out of Wi-Fi or power. All right, so back to this. All right, so when you make something repeatable, let me go back to that. So when you make something repeatable, you have to find out, do I need to make it repeatable in one direction or two directions? One direction being U or V, the other being U and V. Because remember, we're dealing with a flat sheet of paper. Some people call it, X and Y, and other, in Maya, it's going to be U and V space. So usually if you're working for somebody and they say, make this repeatable, unless they tell you otherwise, assume that you are making it repeat in both directions. That is the safest assumption. So let's go back to our Photoshop image here. Let's talk a little bit about using the clone stamp tool. And what I like to kind of preach and teach is called non-destructive workflow. So whenever you work on anything, remember when you download stuff off the internet, the most common file format you're going to get, one of the two is going to be JPEG. The other is probably going to be PNG, maybe TIFF. All right, but JPEGs, just remember, are compressed files, meaning information is thrown away that the algorithm or the compression thinks that it can rebuild when you open the image again. So let's see. Let's have a really easy, simple example. Well, that's not simple. That's not easy. Let's just go new. Yep, that's fine. Create. All right. So let me just go in here and so I've got an image here. To compress this, JPEG would look at it and go, all right, you got a whole bunch of white pixels here. I can throw out a lot of those white pixels and save space. Because remember, every little bit, every byte of information that you can throw out makes the file size smaller. So in cases where you get an option for compression, it'll say, you know, high quality, low compression, low quality, high compression. If you compress it a lot, you'll throw out most of these white pixels, keep some of the black ones, and then when you close it, it will be a very small file. When you reopen it, the algorithm, or the way the compression is decompressed, is areas that are missing will be filled in with areas that exist. So in the compression, when you save it, it'll go, we got rid of 85% of the white pixels, rebuild that 85% using the remaining 15%. And it'll put those 15% back in to the rest of the scene. Take the black, it'll say, maintain whatever, however many black it needs, because there's a lot of contrast there between the white and the black. Keep that, throw away, it'll keep like maybe, I don't know, 50% of the black, throw the rest of it away. And then when you reopen it, it'll put the rest of those black pixels, it will remake them from the existing pixels. Now, every time you open a JPEG file, work on it, close it, you decompress it, work on it, save it, recompress it, so you throw information away. Maybe open it again to work on it. You are rebuilding it based on whatever remains, working on it, closing it, throwing stuff away. After you do that 10 times, you degrade the quality of the image 50%. Because you're constantly opening, working, throwing stuff away, closing it. Ideally, when you get something off the internet and you think you're going to be working on it, open it in Photoshop, save it as a Photoshop PSD file. Why? Say? Yeah. So you can go back. Also, yep, Photoshop basically is a lossless system. Photoshop will only remove things that it knows it can 100% put back in to be accurate. So Photoshop files consequently are a lot bigger, but they are considered lossless. And bonus with Photoshop is if you work on it and you work in layers, put stuff on top of it, you can hide stuff, it will save that layering system for you. Whereas if you flatten it, turn it into a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF file, even a Targa, they cannot maintain layers. Only the Photoshop, well, and a couple other formats like EXR can do it. There's a couple others that can maintain layering. But Photoshop in its native PSD format is the safest thing to archive a file that you may want to work on or have worked on and keep it the highest quality possible. Does that make sense? So the first thing you want to do when you get an image, open it in Photoshop, save it as a PSD. When you're ready to work on it, open it up, work on it, save it as a PSD. If you've brought a file in from the internet, you open it up in Photoshop and you realize, you know what, I'm really not going to work on it. Save it as a PSD still, but export it in the format that you need it in, either EXR or PNG or Targa or whatever your requirements are. But you'll keep the Photoshop file in case you need to open it up and work on it and maybe reconvert it to another file format. This way you're not compressing, decompressing, compressing, decompressing. Now, let me close this lovely piece of art. Don't save it. So here we've got some areas where we want to remove all these little pieces of white, dirty paper, maybe some of the pools in the tile here on the carpet tiles. Best way to do that in Photoshop is to use non-destructive workflow, which means we are going to use layers and we are going to keep that original, what's called background layer, that very first layer when you open it, we're going to keep that as untouched as possible. Because once you alter those pixels, it's really hard, to undo it without losing work. So, something else about Photoshop too is Photoshop will only apply filters to a single layer. So if you've got a Photoshop file with multiple layers and you want to apply a filter to all those layers, you either have to select all those layers and flatten them together into one single layer, or you duplicate those layers, flatten them into a working file, and then work on that layer. But you don't want to flatten all the layers permanently because you're going to lose editability. Yeah, go ahead, Kayvon. Putting them in a folder does not work. It still treats it. Here, I'll show you. So let me create a blank file there. We'll do that on that one. Let's create another one. All right, so I got a couple of layers here. Now, what happens if I want to select all of these and apply a filter to them? All right, I go up here and notice that all my filters are grayed out. Now, if I select just a single file, or sorry, a single layer, I can go up and all my filters are there. Now, if I select all of these and throw them into a layer, well, let's select those two, for example. So now I've got both of my upper layers in a group. Can I apply a filter to that group? No. So Photoshop knows when you're trying to trick it. So ideally, what you want to do is if you need to apply a filter to all these layers. First, let me get rid of those. Just move them out of that group. Go down here. So ideally, what you want to do is select all the layers, duplicate those layers, because if you duplicate them, it will create the word copy on it, and highlight all your duplicated layers. And then you can right click and merge those layers. So now you've got a working version of all three layers that you can then apply a filter to. Again, all non-destructive, trying to maintain those individual layers so that you can go back and edit them. So anytime I do something like that, I just call it merged layer. You know, I name it whatever it is that I merged together. But this way I can apply a filter to it, but at any point I can go back and work on either one of these layers individually, because I can go back and edit this layer without affecting that layer. And those two I can work on independently of that main background layer. Does that make sense? Answer your question, Kayvon? Yep. Now, that's a really good question, because you would think, okay, I stick it in a group. Can I treat that one group as a unit? No, Photoshop knows there's layers inside that group. Sneaky Photoshop. All right, so let me get rid of all that. And let's talk about the basic tool we're going to use, which is the stamp tool, the clone stamp. All right, so clone stamp is just like a bureaucrat's rubber stamper. It's meant for you to be able to sample something from one section, stamp it to another, stamp it or clone, copy it to another section. Now, here's the thing with the clone stamp tool. So my clone stamp tool happens to be right underneath my brush, right there. Before we demo this, let's just talk a little bit about the options for the clone stamp. So with the clone stamp, we want to make sure that our brush, and it's still called a brush, you want to make sure the size, that's pretty simple to change. You guys know the shortcut keys for changing a brush size? Yeah, left and right brackets. You can do the same thing with the clone stamp. It'll do the same thing. Treats it just like a brush. So for example, I've got the clone stamp tool activated. It's got a fairly small size, it's kind of hard to see. But if I do right bracket, it's going to make it bigger. Left bracket makes it smaller, so you can make it to size. Now, one thing about using a clone stamp, make sure the hardness is set for 100%. You do not want blurry edges when you stamp something on top of what you're trying to cover up. Nothing says, hey, somebody altered this, than a blurry edge to something. Next, make sure the mode is set to normal. Opacity is 100%, flow is 100%. We're not trying to feather weight or build weight. Make sure your angle is set to 0. And this is probably the most important change to make. By default, your clone stamp sample is set for the current layer that you are on. You want to change that to current and below. That is the true power of the clone stamp tool. Because what it will let you do is stamp, or actually sample from the layer below, which is what we're going to do, and then stamp on your current layer. Meaning we can sample from our background layer, have a blank layer on top that we're on, stamp on top of that, and we're not altering the original layer. We're stamping on top of it in a new layer. So current and below, we create a new layer here. So now what I can do is to activate the sample part, you hold the Option key down in Photoshop. So if you hold Option down, that turns the little brush area into a target. So that means you are in sample mode. Wherever you click, that will sample that area. So for example, I'm going to work on this little piece of white paper up here, or white fuzz or dirt up in this upper right corner. This is going to be my clone layer. Photoshop, you can use spaces, you can use special characters. Photoshop doesn't care. Now, like I said, first thing you want to do when you're working in Photoshop is save your file as a PSD. This way, I stopped compressing it, and now I can save all my layers. All right, so the idea now is I want to find an area that has similar pixels to the ones I want to cover up. So for example, I don't want to come over here where it's brighter in the center where this kind of brassy electrical access cover is. I don't want to sample here and then stamp over here. That looks ridiculous. Let me Z back. What I want to do is find pixels that are very similar to the ones I want to cover up. So let me go down here, sample that, release the Option key. Now I am in stamp mode. So I stamp on top of it. If I like it, I can use it. If not, good news is I can erase it from that layer. I can delete that layer, but I have not altered my original background pixels. So I can Z back if I don't like it and make sure that your layer is visible. All right, so I didn't like that. Let's go back. Let's try a different section up here instead. And let's sample and stamp. All right, so that's a little better. I can do the same thing over here. Come in, find an area that's very similar to the pixels I want, stamp on top. Down here on a larger area, I will usually sample a couple times because what I'm trying to avoid is grabbing too many pixels and relocating them to another location, because the more pixels you have that you're stamping on, the more noticeable that area is going to be that you took it from another section. So I usually like to come around here and I will kind of sample all around it. Just keep sampling and stamping just to try and get some random pixels in there. So it's not quite as noticeable that I took a large chunk from another section. So I can come up here, do the same thing. Again, I want to try and find dark pixels that are very similar to those. I can even come down here and that little pull in the rug. Let me sample this little line right here, which is the seam. You pop it in here. And now we got rid of a bunch of little imperfections in that file. And we've got the ability of having them all on a layer. So if we don't like it, we can delete the layer, we can erase it on that layer, but we have not altered the original layer that we opened up called the background layer. Does that make sense? So it's non-destructive right now. Now, one of the other big tools that we use is called the healing brush. And for me, my healing brush is right above my brush. It looks like a little Band-Aid. Right? You don't want spot, you don't want patch, you want healing brush. Now, healing brush uses the same almost identical features of the clone stamp with one big exception. So you want to go and you want to make sure you set your brush hardness to be 100%. You want your mode to be normal. You want your source to be sampled. You want to have your sample set to current and below. That's going to be another thing that is an option you have to turn on. And here's the biggest difference between clone stamp. All right, so let me go back to clone stamp and let me just clone this area real quick. All right, I'm going to take an exaggerated area. So if I sample this area and stamp on top, kind of looks like took a bite out of it. So we have actually covered up that electrical access cover completely. With the healing brush will let you sample the same way. Hold Option down, you sample. When it goes to stamp, it looks at the color of what you sampled and the color of the destination and tries to average them together. So now with the healing brush, let me go up and make a big bite size again. Let me come down here and do it. Hold down Option to sample. And when I clone on top of it, notice that it doesn't just cover it up, but it tries to take that brassy color, mix it with the carpet color. So it basically does what's called an interpolation. It kind of tries to blend the two together. That's really good when you've got color variations, especially for when we go dealing with the brick, because some of the bricks have different colors, different shades of reds and oranges. And when you put them side by side, you'll notice there's a color variation. If you use the healing brush, that'll try and blend the two color variations together so it looks more seamless. Does that make sense? So, clone stamp for when you want to fix a seam, cover it completely. You don't have to worry about the colors because the colors are the same. Or you want to take an edge that's broken or an area that's been cut off and replace it. You want to cover it up completely. But when you've got two different colors that you want to try and blend together, the healing brush is really the best tool for that. Questions? Make sense? Got any questions in Zoom?
I'm all good.
Okay.
I'm good.
Thank you, Lanika. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to just save this. Now, in theory, what I could have done was made a separate layer to use just for that, healing brush. And I could have called that healing layer and have a separate layer for the clone. I can have as many layers as I need to cover up my image. And that way, each layer gives me a little more control over what I can add, what I can remove without altering other things. All right, so let's close this out. Close that for now. Let's talk through the workflow of our brick wall. All right, so our brick is not square. And when you make something repeatable, one of the first things you want to do is make the image square, same number of pixels wide as it is high. It makes it easy to repeat. A couple of things we want to do. We want to get rid of the watermark. And notice the top row of bricks is not a full row of bricks. It's gotten a grout. The bottom's the same. Left, this brick right here is going to line up with that. That's really not going to work all that well. That's going to give us a really silly small piece of brick in with big longer bricks in that whole row there. So we're going to crop the image first and keep it square. The crop tool's got an option so that when you resize the crop tool, it keeps it and maintains a square aspect ratio. So we're going to crop it, keep it square. Photoshop has a filter called the offset filter, which works a lot like Maya's repeat U and V. What it will do is allow us to offset the image and see what it looks like when the left side lines up with the right, the top lines up with the bottom. We can find the seams. And what we want to do is put the seams right in the middle of the image so we can clone them out. And then that will make the texture repeatable without being too noticeable. Now, it's going to make a little more sense when we actually go to do it. We don't really want to offset it. Like, say we have an image, it was 800K. We cropped it so it was 500 by 500. We don't want to offset it 500 and watch it repeat. What we want to do is offset it half of 500. So we put the left side in the middle and we put the top in the middle. So we offset it like 250 by 250. That puts our seams right in the middle, and we can go in and we can clone them out. And we don't have to offset it again because once we've offset it, we've already fixed the seams. Because we've taken the edges and put them in the middle. Taking the top and the bottom, put them in the middle. So we offset. We're going to get some, notice if we've cropped it correctly, we're going to get pretty close. And when we offset it, we're going to see where our seams are. So you can see we got a vertical seam. It's not too bad. Horizontal seam is pretty minimal because it's right where the grout is. It's right here in the middle. That's pretty, pretty hidden. So we create a new layer and we start cloning out those little imperfections. Use the healing brush to get rid of any areas where we've got some color variation, like up here, maybe down here. We get rid of them. And we're going to have a couple layers. We're going to have at least a background layer and one clone stamp layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to take those two layers, duplicate them, merge them together into one layer, and we're going to create a separate layer so that we can apply what in effect comes to be a little bit of sharpen. It's called a high pass filter. We're going to apply that high pass filter to sharpen the variations in value in the pixels. And that's going to allow everything that shows through it to have a little more definition. And then once we do all that, that's what the high pass filter looks like. We have to use a blend mode to blend that top layer with all the layers underneath. So we get it to be a little sharpened. That's going to basically be our color map. Once we're done with the color map, then we are going to make a bump map from that color map. Now, what that requires is for us to know what information do we need out of a bump map. Bump map is what kind of file? Anybody remember? What do we need from a bump? We need black and white information. Black is going to represent areas that are low. White will represent areas that are raised or higher. And if we don't want any change at all, that's 50% gray. So a bump map we want to have is black and white. So we don't need color information. So what we wind up doing in Photoshop, or let's go to PowerPoint. So what we wind up doing is we apply what's called an adjustment layer that affects all the layers underneath, and it will turn everything that goes through that adjustment layer, it'll turn it black and white. It's the same adjustment layer I used in your Project 6 template for the close-up. Anything you throw into that folder or under that layer is going to be black and white. And the nice thing is you can turn it off. So we turn it black and white, but if you take a look at the color values or the values that we have now in the brick, what color in a bump map goes in? Which part looks like it gets lowered? You get a 50-50 shot. You got black, you got white. Which one is it? Say again?
Black.
Nelson said it, it's black. Remember, white gets raised up off the surface. Black gets lowered. So this grout, will that go in based on the color information that's up there? Yes, it will go out. So we have to invert that. It'd be like kind of a ice cream sandwich that's really soft ice cream. So you bite into it and all the ice cream oozes out the side. We don't want that from our brick. We want the grout to go in. We want the brick to stand out a little bit more. So we need to invert it. So we use another adjustment layer to invert that. Now we've got the grout going in. We got the bricks. They're pretty much 50% gray. They're going to be there, but they're not going to pop outward. So just to get a little more definition out of those bricks, I like to use what's called a level. Levels give me what's called a histogram, a little picture of where the information is. So areas on the right over here, those are the whites. On the lefts are blacks. In the middle are midtones. This big spike, those are all the bricks. They are 50% gray. That's like mid-tone city right there. What we want to do is we want to adjust the light parts of the image and make them brighter. We want to take the darker areas and make them darker, so we can get more definition out of it. And then basically that's going to be our bump map. That will make the grout go in, the bricks will come out, and all those little flecks and lines and dots in there will all be imperfections in the brick, which I kind of like because bricks are not going to be perfectly smooth unless they've been polished or painted a million times. And even then, they're still going to have little pock marks. Like if you go out and look at our brick pillars, they're painted, but they're still going to have imperfections in them. Does that make sense? All right, so let's go through this. Let's go into Photoshop. Let's load that image in, which is going to be the brick source image. Ah, Photoshop, how lovely. Okay. Wow, what am I doing here? Got too much stuff running still. Let's quit out of you. All right, well, here goes nothing. Save as. First thing I want to do is save it in case anything happens, because after all, Photoshop is spiteful, just like Maya. 2021-09, there's my PSD. All right, so first thing I want to do is crop this. I want to make it square so I can make it repeatable. All right, so I'm going to activate the crop tool. And what I want to do under ratio at the top, the tool options for the crop, I want to change that to be 1:1 square. So now, whenever I move this crop area, it's going to maintain a square aspect ratio. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of that top row of bricks. And let me kind of zoom in. What I want to do is try and get it halfway in the grout. Because the top, when we start repeating it, it's going to line up with the bottom. So I want to get rid of that bottom row of bricks too, put that crop right in there about halfway. So now that top half of the grout will line up with the bottom half of the grout and give me basically a whole course of grout. So that should get rid of the top and bottom problem. But I still have the issue where I've got the watermark in here. Now, the first instinct would be to, well, just move this in. But if you move it in, you're going to resize the whole thing. Let me Z back. So what you can do is in Photoshop, you can actually slide the image around underneath the crop tool. So all I'm going to do is just gently left click and drag it. And Photoshop, since I'm dragging in one direction, kind of realizes that I probably want to keep it level. And it's really doing a pretty good job of keeping it level for me. So I can bring it over here and try and crop it. What's that look like? I could bring it over here. No, it all depends. No, let's try that. Now, I like to zoom in because I like to see what's going on. So what I'm trying to do is get a little bit of grout here, a little bit of grout here. This piece of brick is going to be picked up and attached to this side. This little piece of brick is going to go at the end over here. This half will go over here. This piece will wind up over here. So it might work. Now, once you're doing this in Photoshop, when you're done and you're ready to commit your crop, you can either hit enter or click the little checkbox up top here in the tool options, and that will complete the crop operation. So now I've cropped it. And one thing about the crop tool, make sure you've got delete cropped pixels turned on before you hit the check mark or enter. If you don't have that turned on, those pixels will look like they go away, but they come back to haunt you when you go to offset it. Photoshop's evil, just like Maya. Just because Adobe makes it doesn't make it any less evil. So, what's that? I don't know. Autodesk is pretty evil. It'd be an evil off somewhere we'd have to have. Yeah. All right, so now we've got that. Before I save, though, what I want to do is offset this to see if it's going to work. If I offset it and stuff looks like a Picasso painting and it's all weird, I'll undo, go back, undo my crop, and recrop it again. Spend time cropping it, and you'll save a lot of time when you go to clean up seams. It's totally worth the extra effort. So what I'm going to do now is offset this, but I need to figure out how much do I need to offset it. Well, down here at the bottom left of your image, you should see the pixels in X and Y. So my image was not square, but now my new image is 788 by 788. Now, some of you will probably have different numbers like 787, 786, 789. All right, whatever. If you have odd number pixels, go to the next even one. And what we're going to do is I want to take that 788 by 788 and divide that 788 in half. And since I'm not a math whiz and I can't do it in my head, I'm going to bring up my calculator and go to friendly mode. So 788 divided by 2, that's 394. So that's going to be my offset in vertical and horizontal in the actual offset filter. Now, since this is a single layer, Photoshop will let me use a filter on this layer. So we go up to the filter menu, we go to other, and anytime you've got an ellipse after any kind of menu, item, tool, command, if you've got an ellipse, that means it brings up another window to give you more input. If it has no ellipse or no three little dots, that means it will perform that operation in command without any further information from you. So I want to go filter, other, offset. And usually by default, the offset will be set for 0 horizontal and 0 vertical. Now, a couple things in here, make sure preview is turned on so you can actually see what it looks like in your image. And make sure it's set to under undefined areas, wrap around. And what I want to do is take my 394, which was my 788 divided in half, and plug that into horizontal, and then go down and plug that into vertical. Whoops, 394. So now you can see I chose that area, and actually I got pretty decent results. My seam is right here in the middle. 394. So it looks pretty good. If yours does not look decent or you've got just a few things to fix up, that'll work. But if you've got a lot of stuff, you might want to cancel it, go back and recrop it. This one looks like it'll work for me because there's my seam right here in the middle. And here's my other seam here. So I'm going to click OK because this works for me. I'm going to get out of my crop tool. And let's zoom in and see what we got here. All right, so here's my seam up here. I got a little bit of work to do here and here. A lot of this is color variation stuff, which is perfect for the healing brush. Some of it, like this, I got to fix. I actually got to crop that or clone stamp that. Clone stamp that. The seams aren't too bad. And here in the middle, it's barely noticeable that there is a seam in there. That grout is pretty forgiving. So at this point, I'm pretty happy. Before I do any further work, I'm going to save. File, save. And I'm going to add a separate layer. And I'm going to go in and start clone stamping and using the healing brush. So for this bottom seam here, I'll probably use the clone stamp to kind of get this a little smoother. For the color variations, I'll probably use the healing brush. So clone stamp, I'm going to scale it kind of way down. And let me take an area like right around here where it starts to go up a little. I might be able to pop it in there. So just that little bit of area kind of helped it transition much better. Now, I could probably do the same thing here, but I'd rather use the healing brush in that area. So let me get the healing brush, scale that down. And let's come over here and see if we can't just try and smooth out that area. So clone stamp and healing brush have gotten rid of those seams pretty well. Does that make sense? So take your time. Like here, I'm going to do the top part. Probably should clone stamp that, but the middle part here, I'm going to see if I can't wind up using, whoops, got to turn that layer on. I want to wind up using my healing brush just to kind of smooth that out a little bit more. Now, the bottom areas, yeah, I probably want to use clone stamp here. So let me see if I can find an area, like maybe around here. And again, I'm just trying to go in and work with what I got here. All right, so try and pick that area up. Let's see if we can make this a little more friendly. And then take the healing brush and kind of fill in the gaps. And I'm going to sample different areas just so I don't get the same result everywhere. So up here, obviously, this is going to be clone stamp right in that little section there. And let's take it right around here. And then we get the healing brush over here. Take this little area. So again, it's going to be a combination of clone stamp in this area. Maybe a little healing brush also. Come down here, do this area. It's a little more noticeable. Over here, definitely clone stamp. Healing brush. Come back in. Just to kind of abbreviate this, I'm going to kind of roll with the rest of what I've got here. Actually, I probably should just touch these up pretty quick. Let's get here. And I'm just looking for areas that'll add a little variation so it doesn't look like I'm grabbing the same areas all the time. Let's go over here. Oops, don't want to get too close. Watch that healing brush near the edges. It tends to make everything blur in with the grout. So for those edges, definitely want to get and maybe I just take a small part right here. Just clone that in there real quick. Healing brush over there. Same thing here. All right, so it's a little less noticeable. All right, so this is all the work I've done. It's kind of minimal, but it is noticeable. All right. So going to go under the assumption that's pretty much done. Like I said, just to kind of cut down the time on this, like I said, I would obsess about this a little bit longer, but just so I can keep this going forward for you guys, what I'm going to do now is apply a high pass filter, which will basically allow me to sharpen up the detail in the bricks a little bit more. So there's tons of sharpening tools in Photoshop. There's the sharpen tool, sharpen more, sharpen edges, unsharp mask, smart sharpen, motion sharpen, motion blur. There's all kinds of tools in Photoshop. But for an average ordinary texture, a lot of times what we want to do is overall get more contrast between the lights and darks. And then we're talking light and dark value in the pixels, just to get a little more detail. What that will do is give us a little more sharpening detail between the, all the little nooks and crannies in the brick. So in order to use the high pass filter, which is a filter, I want to select both my clone layer, which I've got right here, and my background layer, and I'm going to duplicate them because it is more than one layer. All right, so I'm just going to go up, duplicate layers, don't even worry about the name. It's going to put the word copy on it for me and highlight them both. Next, what I want to do is merge them so that they become one unified layer I can apply that high pass filter to. So let's right click on those two selected layers and merge the layers. And I'm going to rename this, and this is going to be called my high pass filter. So right now, this high pass filter is a combination of my background layer and my clone layer. Now, to apply the high pass filter, make sure you've got the right layer selected. Go to Filter, Other, High Pass, which is the second one down. Now, the high pass filter really, as the name implies, it allows the absolute brights and absolute darks to remain where they are. And it allows the midtones in the middle to have a little more contrast between the subtle variations in the midtones. So there's a whole bunch of ranges that you can have. It's called radius. So the higher the radius, the bigger the area, our image isn't even 1,000 pixels. So if I make the radius bigger than the actual image, it takes up the whole image. Honestly, the best radius is somewhere between 1 and 2. And I usually set mine to 1.5 to start. If I don't like it, I can undo it and come back. But what that's going to do is give me a kind of medium sharpening of the midtones. So what I'm going to do is click OK. Now that layer looks like it's completely destroyed, but thanks to the magic of Photoshop blend modes in Photoshop allow layers to interact with other layers based on what you tell it to do, what kind of blend mode. By default, layers are set to cover up lower layers. So for the high pass filter, I want to try different blend modes to find the one that'll give me the right result. So the nice thing about the new versions of Photoshop, well, new versions, since Photoshop went to the Creative Cloud Suite, is they give you a preview in your image of what each blend mode looks like. Older versions, you had to apply it. You didn't like it, you undid it. Blend modes are right up here, right underneath the layer where it says normal. And you've got things like normal means it just covers up all the lower layers. Dissolve doesn't do anything. Darken, I don't need that layer to darken everything as it passes through it. I don't want to multiply it. Multiplying it means that you're basically getting rid of a lot of the lights. Color burn, nah, I don't like that. Linear, darken, no. Lighten, no. Screen, way too bright. Dodge color, add, we're adding the colors together that, makes them twice as bright. Overlay is actually what we want. Overlay will allow the midtones of all the lower layers to come through as they are, but get filtered through that high pass layer. Now, let me kind of zoom in, and hopefully you guys can see on the projector and maybe even in Zoom what it's doing. So here is my image without the high pass layer turned on. Okay, now when I turn it on, notice it becomes, well, hopefully you can see, it becomes a little bit crisper, a little bit sharper with it on than with it off. So what we're doing is we're taking that midtone detail, that little tiny variations in midtone gray, we're giving it more contrast there and filtering the lower layers through there so they pick up that extra detail. So it looks like all the detail is crisper and sharper. That's really all we're doing. We're basically just trying to make this image look a little crisper because it's probably been softened with several variations of being a JPEG. Who knows how many times it got saved and redone in the internet before you downloaded it. So we don't know how many, times it's been opened and how far it's degraded. But just that little bit of sharpen makes a difference. If you want more, undo, go back, try the high pass filter at a higher number. Too much. The nice thing is we can turn the opacity down, and that kind of acts like a intensity control. Very subtle, but you can kind of adjust the amount of high pass sharpen that you allow to show. I'm going to keep mine at 100%. All right, so those three layers are now going to be my base color. And the nice thing is in Photoshop, I save it. It's now a PSD. It's got individual layers. I'm going to save as. And in Photoshop, you guys are painfully aware, I'm sure, that if you want to save it in anything other than what the very narrow list is that's here, you have to click Save a Copy. So we're going to bring it back into Maya as a target file. because targas are relatively lossless and keep a decent amount of quality. So format, Photoshop, nah, save as. Now we're going to save it as a targa. And I'm going to rename it, get rid of that word copy up there. And I like to I'm going to put base color. You can put diffuse color as long as it makes sense. If you hand this off to somebody and they're going to put your maps in to Maya, you want them to more or less know where they go. So label them base color, spec, roughness, bump. So base color, click save. Targa options, 24-bit. 24-bit gives you RGB, red, green, blue, 8 bits per channel, 16.5 million colors. Perfect. That's what we're used to seeing. We'll get to 32 later when we get into lecture 10, when we need alpha channels. We're going to be storing alpha information in files and be able to pull that in Maya as a separate map. We're going to actually use it for doing the wine label on the bottle to remove unwanted portions of the geometry and keep just the shape of our label. That way we don't have to model any kind of weird shape. Downside is it only shows up at render time, but it does a good job. So for now, 24-bit targa, still got my PSD. Life is good so far. Now we need to make a bump map from this file. So to make a bump map, we kind of already talked through this. What kind of information do we need? Black and white. So adjustment layers in Photoshop can be found down at the bottom where all the little icons are. There's the trash icon, create a new layer. There's the group icon. Looks like a half dark, half light circle. If you click on it, it brings up a whole kind of subset of layers that you can get. What we're interested in is right in the middle, it says black and white. Now, if I choose that, Photoshop creates a brand new layer above everything else, takes all the red, all the green, all the blue, converts them to the appropriate shade of gray. And you don't have to adjust anything in the properties. Photoshop did it for you automatically. Now, granted, you could go up under the image menu, convert it to black and white, but then you've destroyed all the color information in the whole image. We only want to do this on a layer so that we can turn it off if we have to go back and do something else with our color. So Photoshop layers are the bomb. Photoshop is one of the first programs to do layering. Most paint programs in the early days of computers were all just pixel-based. You destroyed pixels when you worked on top of it. When Photoshop came out in roughly 1990, somewhere around there, I was doing graphic design and I thought that somebody had given me the greatest tool in the world. Because until then, you used paint. Was at the time, if you were on a Mac, you used Mac Paint, or you used Corel Paint if you're on a PC or on a Mac, and none of that had layering. That was all pretty much destructive work. But when Photoshop came along and said, hey, you know what? You can put stuff on top of this layer, and anything on top of that will show, as long as that top layer is transparent, you can put stuff on top where you want it. So now all of a sudden you had the ability to alter a file without killing the original pixels. All right, so enough of my soapbox about Photoshop. So black and white. Next, we say to ourselves, okay, we got the right information. Is this going to give me the desired results that I want? So in a bump map, remember, black looks like it gets indented or etched into the surface. White looks like it's embossed or raised up. If you don't want any changes, 50% gray. So does this give us what we want? No. We kind of talked through this already. We need it to do the exact opposite of what it's giving us. We don't want that grout to look like it's coming out of the wall. We want to make it look like it's going in and the bricks are coming out. So another Photoshop adjustment layer called invert down toward the bottom. That will basically flip all your values to the opposite end of the spectrum. So now we've made it black and white. We've inverted it. This will give us the desired result. But those bricks are really lots of gray. There's not much detail in them. Now, a lot of people will say, okay, well, we've inverted the brick. Doesn't that mean that anything that's dark is going to go in and anything that's light is going to come out? Isn't that going to give us the opposite on the brick? Yes, it will. But most people are not going to notice that because bricks look scratched and rough anyway. And nobody's going to know whether that little bubble was really indented or that indentation was really a bubble or a scratch. Isn't really just some, raised imperfection in the surface from it being roughed into shape. So now we want to get more contrast between our darks and lights. To do that, we're going to use another Photoshop adjustment layer called levels. And honestly, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure, they can pretty much all give you the same results if you work hard enough at them. But like I said, I like levels because I like this little picture here. That tells me a lot about the image. So we kind of make this a little bit longer. There we go. And the reason I'm making it longer is because, can I make this smaller, this area? Yes, I can. Good. All right. So what I want to do is get as much of this property up as possible. So levels. On the right side, this little slider, that is your brightest part in the image. Right now, it's all the way to the right. That represents absolute white. All the way on the left, that's the darkest part of your image. That represents black, or the darkest area inside your image. And in the middle, right here, that represents what are called the midtones, 50% gray in around that area. Notice that big, huge spike. That's because that's where all the bricks are. And notice there's basically no absolute white at all. Notice that our little histogram doesn't even start to raise up till right around this area, all the way over here. And there's no darks really until it starts to raise up in this area. So what we do is we say, you know what, Photoshop, I want this area right here where it starts to slope up. I want that to be my brightest area. And I want this area to the left where it starts to slope up and get really dark. Well, I want to put that somewhere where it starts to slope up, maybe even in the middle, to get a super dark area. So I get a nice deep indentation. And now I can adjust my 50% gray. I can say, well, do I want more gray or less gray? If I want more gray, I can pull this slider to the right and make everything really darker. If I drag that midtone to the left, then I'm increasing the amount of light in that 50% gray. So now I pull it like maybe down here. So now my bricks are a lot lighter in color. My grout got a little more gray, but I can compensate for that by moving the grout area, move this in. So that's what my original looked like. And with the level changes I've made, Notice I get the bricks to be a little lighter. I get the grout to be a little darker. And now I got more contrast. That should give me a much better looking bump map, rather than something like this, the original, which would be pretty much flat. Does that make sense? So in a bump map, I mean, the nice thing about doing it in Photoshop is you get to really tweak what your bump map is going to look like. The downside is it's not automated like it is in Substance. But if you know what you're doing, if you know what you want, you can alter it in Substance also. You just need to use more contrast in your bump map setting. Because you're making all your maps at once. You have the ability to change how much value is in it when you're working on it. All right, so this represents my bump map, saving my Photoshop PSD. And just remember, anytime you want to get back to the color, just turn off all your black and white layers and you're back to color immediately. Now, if you accidentally turn something off, out of order, inverting it's going to invert the blues, make them red, or make the blues, or make the reds blue. So just remember, turn them all off or turn them all on. And you can basically put all of these adjustment layers into one group and just call it black and white bump map. But I prefer having my layers individual. Turn them on, save my PSD. Now I'm going to save as. And again, I have to make a copy of it. I want to change the format to Targa, and this is going to be my bump. Hit save, same deal, Targa options, 24-bit. Right, so now let's quit out of Photoshop. I'm actually going to quit out of PowerPoint. Let's take a look at our maps. And basically what I want to do is fire up Maya and show you what that brick texture looks like when I bring it in. All right, so here is my base color. And here is my bump map. Different information, all from the same file. So I'm going to take the two of these, copy them, and they're going to go into my Zen Garden source images folder. So when I fire up Maya and set my project, my files will be ready for me, all set to go. And there's the rain. Sorry, torrential downpour. There we go. Just remember, in Florida, don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. All right, so Maya's loaded. Let's go File, Set Project. Project 7, Zen Garden. That's good. Let's open up the Lecture 8 file. Don't worry about data loss. Stop bugging me, RenderMan. All right, now that is my brick. I'm going to call this default brick because that's exactly what I got with that file. And I'm going to make a new material. This way I've got my default brick if I want to put it on something else and compare the two, or I just want to duplicate it, look at it side by side. But I'm going to make a new material. So Shift T, And let's call this seamless brick. All right, so seamless brick. Let's go in, base color. Click the little checker input button. Under create render node, 2D texture, file. And let's bring in our brick. All right, so there's my base color. Let's bring that in. Take a look at it. Now it looks stretched. Okay, no problem with that. Let's go in and let's repeat it. So we want to make it smaller. So I could go in, try and redo the UVs, or I can just go, you know what? It's repeating. I need it to repeat more in one direction than I do in another, because right now it's coming in stretched. So what happens if I double it in X or in U? So now it starts to look a little better. That's because our texture is now square and our surface is rectangular. Does that make sense? So, you could go in, re-UV it, or you could just make it repeat. Either way will work. But you can see that it looks a whole lot better and much less noticeable when it repeats than before. We don't have that watermark. We don't have the missing grout in the middle of it. And now we can add stuff on top of it if we want to. Now you could take this into Substance and put it on a wall and start, putting graffiti on it or do whatever you want. So if I want to make this even smaller, let's try changing this. Let's go 6 and 3. So now it's much, much smaller. And ideally, what you want to do is get this so that the scale of it matches your environment. Like right now, those bricks are pretty big compared to our environment. All right, so let's try 8 and 4. That still looks pretty darn big. How about 12 and 6? A little bit better. I mean, ideally, you want to work from reference. You want to be able to have reference of a brick patio with objects on it so you can see the relationship of the scale of the brick to your furniture. That still looks like pretty darn big brick. So let's try 16 and 8. Again, just trying to dial in what that scale would be. Now, once you scale it that, or make it repeat that many times, if you zoom out, you are going to notice that it is, slightly repeating. But close up, you're not really going to notice it all that much. And ideally, we could always add other things, like I said, on top of it. You could go, if we took this into Substance, you could throw a noise layer on top of it to kind of add a little splotchiness where the bricks are different colors. There's a whole lot of things you could do. In fact, later on at the end, I'm going to show you a couple of things you can do in layering where you can take different levels of color saturation from the files and have one with the original level of saturation and one that's desaturated a little. So it looks like some of the bricks are faded and others aren't. And they kind of fade in and out. Because believe it or not, there are some Maya procedurals that will do that for you. They're not nearly as elegant as Substance, but they're not bad. Most people, Maya, that sucks. Yeah, they do, but some of the stuff you can actually work with. It's just finding, something that will work for what you need it to do. Like I said, most of the time you're going to be doing this stuff in Substance. But if you're in a pinch, you're doing a presentation for somebody and they go, yeah, we love it, but what would it look like if we had the bricks kind of fading in and out, different color variations? Well, okay, give me like 2 minutes and I'll make some layers in Maya and I'll throw a couple things in the layers so we can see what it looks like. There are ways to do that. All right, so now what we could do is we could take this and we could also throw our bump map on top of it. Now, bump map isn't going to show up very well in the viewport, but it sort of will show up. And let's kind of see what that does. All right, so I'm going to select my brick, go to my material, and let's go down to where do I plug bumps into? Anybody remember? To where? All right, so bump maps, they go into geometry to the bump mapping section down there. So there's only two things we use in geometry. One is thin walled for window panes, and the other is bump maps. Oh, I lied. And sometimes opacity. Yeah. Other than that, just those three things. Well, maybe four. No, just kidding. So bump mapping, check our button. 2D textures, file. In the file, which is actually plugged into the value, this is where we plug our bump map in. So where are we? Zen Garden. Let's go down to lecture. There's our bump. We bring it in. So by default, you can see that bump does not match the bricks, right? The bump is way bigger than the bricks. So you could say, well, can't you just make that map repeat the same number of times that you did for the color? And the answer is yes, I could. But wouldn't it be better to have one place 2D drive both the color and the bump together, so you don't have two places to change something? So let's go into the hypershade and look at this. All right, so here is my default brick, and here's my seamless brick. All right, so yeah. Come on, Photoshop and Maya. Photoshop, let go of all that memory. Stop being Maya. All right, well, so you can see, I hate when Maya crisscrosses this. This really belongs up here. This really belongs down here, so I can see everything a little bit better. So let's grab you, bring you down here. All right, so right now I've got two place 2D textures, right? One is driving my brick, one is driving my color. The one that I like is the color. I like the small brick pattern. So what I want to do is I want this to drive this. Now, normally you would say, can't you just grab these and take it and drag it down there? You can, but you get the connection editor. And there's too many connections because it's all UV information for every single one of these little connections. So there is a much better way to do this. So right next to that little orange ball in my place 2D, there's this little kind of, it looks like an icon that looks like Burger King. It's kind of got those three little lines in it. That's really a level of detail to show you all the connections that are possible. By default, it gives you kind of a collapsed view, so you don't really need to see all this stuff. But those are all the connections that are going in there. Very scary. So we don't like to be frightened, so we keep it closed. Kind of like opening Pandora's box. Now, what we can do is we can get this to drive this, but it requires the middle mouse button and a modifier key. The modifier key in this case is the command key on the Mac or the control key on a PC. So what we do is we take the place 2D that has the good information, we hold the command key down, middle mouse click right here where that little stacking icon is, we drag it, we drop it on top of, there's a little M there, or sometimes it's a color of your texture. In this case, it's the brick bump. We release the mouse button. No, cancel U. And release the command key. So let me Z back in Maya and redo that again. Stop. Z, Z. There we go. One more time. So hold command, middle mouse click right on this little detail stacking icon here, level of detail for your place 2D. Click middle mouse drag it here next to the little orange ball, release the mouse. If your connection editor pops up, just click close. And come on, my tablet's wigging out. Wow, get out of here. All right, wait, let me just close that. All right, fatal error, there you go. So you can see that the bump map got smaller. So when I click OK, all will be well and all my pain will disappear. As Maya crashes. Yes, send a report. I hate this. Oh yeah, fill up their box, their inbox. Whenever you get a crash, yeah, fill it up. Don't put like nasty stuff in there. Just put like weird stuff. That way, if anybody reads it, if they're liable to read it if there's something weird in there, but then if it's this was my whole life's work, and it all destroyed on me, and I hate you. You know, just put in a galaxy far, far away, there lived a person that lived in an ideal world where computers and humans work together side by side. This is not one of them. Yeah. All right. So before all that happened, you guys got the idea, right? So I saved, I can go back and kind of redo that, but we'll save that for later on lecture when I'll show you how to take the brick, put in a couple of other features and combine it together with something in Maya. All right, so what a great way to conclude a lecture and a demo, having Maya crash on you. That's like epic. All right, so a lot of stuff to go through. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I highly recommend trying the brick texture if you haven't done it, because it's good practice. Anybody in game art, you want to learn how to do repeatable textures. You can't always rely on being able to find one on the internet. A lot of times they will give you stuff and go, here, make this repeatable, or fix this, or, you know, adjust that. So having some Photoshop skills is very important, because you want to process all your images before you bring them into Substance. Substance cannot make a texture repeatable. Photoshop can, and then you can take it into Substance and then do your wizardry in there. Questions before I send you into the storm for dinner? All right. Yes. I would recommend, what I would do is, before you do your final render, save as, save another version of your scene file, and then remove all the unwanted nodes. That will cut down on your render times. You know, even though it might be like a few milliseconds for each node, that's all going to add up if you've got a huge scene. And if you've got an animation, that takes a lot of time because you got a lot of frames. So it's just more efficient for the renderer to read less information. Make sense? It's kind of like you guys did optimize scene size for modeling, right? It's kind of like that. There is a feature like that for shading and lighting, but I'd rather have people go in and do it manually so that you know what it's doing in the hypershade, because that's really where we have all our mess. Whereas in modeling, you've got all that construction history, all, you know, unused nodes floating around somewhere from modeling and creating shapes and stuff. So yeah, our mess is usually hypershade related. Good question. All right. Any questions in Zoom before we get out of here? You people at home are lucky. You can just kind of like wander out to the living room or the kitchen.
No, sir.
All right. So let's see. Okay, yeah, I don't have that running. Let's bring up. Let's see. By the time we get out of here, let's call it. Well, let's call it 22. So come back at 6:23. There you go. Extra minute. Yay. All right. So have a good weekend, guys. Don't forget on Monday, Anthony Bagsby, who is our ACD, will be doing Substance Painter with you guys. Yep, no problem, Gaetano. They'll give me, I'll render out lecture. By the time you get back from break, it'll probably be ready on YouTube. All right, so have a good weekend. Have a good dinner break. I will see you guys on Wednesday. Be back for lab at 6:23.